Tired of the stereotypes?
Done with being overlooked?
It's time to change the narrative.
Welcome to East of Me, Tales in the Tea. We're your host, Ji-Hye Choi, a Korean immigrant settler in so-called Canada.
And Samantha Louis Poon, a second-generation Chinese settler in so-called Canada. And this is a podcast where we'll be sipping tea and spilling the tea on the real experiences of East Asian women in North America.
One book, one story, and one conversation at a time. Let's get into it.
So I feel when a lot of people are doing advocacy and activism work, like there's this, expectation from an outwards, point of view that everyone should be denouncing patriarchy or other systems of oppression at all times, whatever circumstance, without understanding like the full context of people's own journey and the context that they're also surrounded by, right? Oftentimes, I think like this idea of even courage comes into play because people are always like, oh, you have to have courage and all this stuff and do advocacy and, be that activist and blah, 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 blah. And there's all these narratives around that. And when we actually depict it, like oftentimes it's not this idea of courage, right? Like that people sometimes might not, say something or like be on the front lines doing activism. Like it is so much more complex than that. Like this idea of even do people, if they're in a state of survival, they don't have the capacity to be doing that. And also if they're safe or not, right? What if, doing, denouncing patriarchy in a certain context actually will make it so unsafe for somebody that, there's just too much risk at play. So I think that's like an important perspective from this book is that understanding the different contexts at different times through different generations, it leads to different ways that people can show up and how they can show up. And I think that like I bring that into like my own lens as well from this book is that, we can't be expecting everyone to show up in the same ways because there's always going to be different ways that people show up and navigate different systems of oppression. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was like very apparent as well, like in the different generations.
Yeah, like kind of going back to like Mozazu and his girlfriend, like Mozazu, for example, like he didn't agree with his girlfriend, but he never like voice it like outwardly saying like you're wrong, my way is right. And I really appreciated that, like just different perspective, different approaches to the family history and cultural history. And I also agree with that it's not always about like courage when we speak up or point out oppressions, because some people might say I'm being brave by like sharing a story on Instagram, but I'm like, how much of courage did that take? Or outside of that, like, are you really being courageous, like when you speak up, if you do at all? So I think maybe it's nice to kind of like separate the two, that like doesn't always have to be this big courageous act. And if you do, like obviously it requires sacrifices. And then I think maybe it's a differences in like what kind of sacrifices people are willing to make that sometimes lead people to showing up differently, right? And even in the book, there were different people willing to make different sacrifices, I feel like. So just wanted to highlight that. Like Noah, for example, like I feel like there was not a lot that he was willing to sacrifice, I feel like, in terms of identity or even making compromises. I guess he did, but then I think, in the end, like there's a tragic ending to his story, unfortunately. And I feel like he did everything that he possibly could, or what he thought would benefit him. But in the end, he didn't feel good enough just to be himself, be who he is.
Yeah, because even the idea of like how much people are willing to sacrifice, and sometimes I feel like it's almost like how much people actually can sacrifice, because it's like people have different, they're in different circumstances, so they have different capacities what they can actually sacrifice in different instances. And of course, if people are in a position of power or have privilege, of course we want people then to sacrifice. Is it even a sacrifice, right, to stand up to oppressions, and if they're in that position, but then to expect people who are actively undergoing certain in like situations where they actually can't because it will risk too much in their life, or they actually like are just in a state of survival. Like they actually, to expect people to then like have this ability to show up for activism, I think is almost unrealistic in that aspect. So, and I think that's like such an important part of like collective action, right? When people do have the privilege to stand up in the face of oppressions, like we have to, because sometimes people aren't in a situation where they can, and so I think this is an important lesson, I think, for a lot of people when we're being engaged in a lot of like advocacy or activism. So I think that's also something that I've been reflecting on, like in the past little bit, of even how do we show up for different causes that have been happening. And so it's important to be reminded of people's different situations and have that lens when we're being engaged. So
I feel like when we do some advocacy work, or when we call things out or call people out, I feel like it draws negative attention. And I feel like maybe it truly means to be courageous when we're not afraid of negative attention, and staying true to your message and what you're trying to get across. I wonder if like that could be something courageous that people can focus on.
Actually walking the walk. And I think that's something that we both resonate on, right? It's this idea of like, even in like today's time, when we think about different people or groups, and it's like a lot of people have a message that they want to advocate for, and at the same time it's important to actually like live through that message as well. Like something I guess related on a different capacity is like in my work, doing research, and a lot of people try to do or like enjoy doing community-based research, and kind of like promote themselves and create this identity around this idea that they're partnering with people in the community, or community members, or patients, or people with lived experiences, but then in their own lives, in their personal lives, like this is not a value or something that they live through on a day-to-day basis. And this goes back on a larger scale with when we are standing up in the face of oppression, when we are advocating, like it's important to actually, have those values in our own life and the daily choices that we do make, because then, what is the advocacy for? What is the message that people are trying to get across, right? And it maybe even goes back to this idea that we were talking about before, is like trusting people, right? Because it's like, if you're not actually living through or having these values on a day-to-day basis, like how can we actually rely on each other, trust each other, and actually be in a community together to further a cause, or right? So it's so there's so many different layers, but
I think you brought up a good point, because I feel like there's like hint of like allyship in the book. So Noah's first girlfriend, I can't remember her name, but she was a Japanese girlfriend who came from a rich family. But then she would call out racism towards Korean people. But then how they broke up is she framed it as like, you're a good Korean. And then the fact that she even labeled him as a good Korean, he said, you're just like the rest of them. Telling me I'm a good Korean means you only see us as good or bad, and you're just like I got chills. I'm gonna sip a little tea for that one. You know what I mean? And when we think about some allyship later in the book, we have the cop friend, who sees injustices happening to this one Korean kid who ended up dying by suicide because of all the name calling, and then his Japanese classmates saying horrible things in his yearbook, and his family had no idea, and then it only came out during investigation. So different forms of allyship, but I think Solomon, because he was the one that was working with a big firm, right? And then he thought that his boss or manager was this ally who saw him as who he was, like as a valued person, regardless of him being Korean or not. But then we get to a point where we're like, ooh. Also, Solomon being seen as a maybe bad Korean in that case, but just this binary of good Korean, bad Korean. But I feel like it's almost a myth, because when we look at the whole picture of the book and then what we talk about, it's like this idea of a good Korean. It's almost like a myth or like a fairy tale, because at the end of the day, where did all three generations end up? Pachinko. The title of the book. And what did it mean if you work for a Pachinko? You're a Yakuza, right? And as a Korean, if you seemed privileged, especially financially, you got that through some wrong means or some immoral means, and there's no way you could be living this way. So yeah, touching on a bit of allyship, and it kind of goes back to like, who do we trust when people show up as, allies, or what does that really mean for us? And then can we actually trust them? And do I actually trust them? In my personal experience, I always look for consistencies. And then when people are not being consistent, it's such a red flag for me, and I just want to like run away. Yeah. But then remembering what you said about, people have different experiences, different things that they're going through, that they may not be able to show up the way they want to show up. But then if that happens consistently, then I may say, maybe you're not an ally for me. You know what I mean? I'm like, maybe for somebody else, but I need a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. I feel that's very similar to me, right? Because it's like, how can you feel like you can rely on a person that, or people that, aren't, being consistent and actually having those, values on a, day-to-day basis. But I really want to go back to this idea of like good Korean, bad Korean, right? Yeah. Because that's such a important part of the book, and also like people's perceptions of other people, and even like how, East Asian people are seen in, this context right now of like so-called Canada and current, you know, society and state. So did you want to elaborate a little more on this concept of?
Yeah. I think one thing I wanted to highlight was this constant struggle of proving to others that you are worthy. And I think Noah was a perfect example of that. You know, he tried to speak perfect Japanese, tried to look Japanese, married a Japanese wife, went to the best Japanese university, but that still wasn't enough, right? And then sometimes I feel that way in the sense that like, oh, I am Korean and I'm very proud of who I am, so I feel like I need to be a good Korean. It'll kill me if somebody like looked at me and I was like, man, she's a bad person and she's a bad Korean. You know, like that would be my worst nightmare. And I'd be like, oh my God, do you know what my ancestors went through? And then for me to shame them. So again, it's shame. But at the same time, like this binary of good and bad, I don't really like it because it really like limits our identity as like one or the other, like black and white. But then also, even if I am a good Korean, like let's say I am considered a good Korean by others, sometimes it also feels like I am an exception. You know, like people could still be racist to every other Korean, but they're nice to me. I'm like, I don't like that either. Why can't you be nice to all Koreans? You know what I mean? So in the book, no matter how hard they tried, you were either considered as a good Korean or a bad Korean. But if you were a good Korean, they were kind of like exceptions, unfortunately. And even that didn't hold very long. So it was very sad to see in terms of like that effect of colonization, that like no matter how hard you try, you're just, as a colonized person, you're never good enough to your colonizer.
It's so true, and you said it like absolutely perfectly. Like that's absolutely what it is, right? And it's having this binary. It doesn't make room for, you know, people's identities, but also it's so problematic because it's other people's perception of who you are, and then labeling you, putting you into this box, and then being like, okay, this is who you are. And it doesn't allow people to create their own identities of themselves, right? It's forced onto you. And that's, you know, what we see even today, like in this, you know, context of, you know, people viewing different people in certain ways, and then all of a sudden they're labeled as, you know, a foreigner, or, you know, being othered in that way. And I think that's, you know, important to keep thinking about. And like from my personal like perspective as well, like it's also like is related to this idea of like, for East Asian people specifically, you know, in so-called Canada, in you know, this context, this idea of, you know, either, you know, you couldn't be, you know, this model minority where it's like, wow, you have achieved so much, you became a doctor or a lawyer, or you're so well off, and all these components. So then somehow, you know, this proximity to whiteness, which is absolutely not true, you become like accepted by people. And then there's this alternate, you know, stereotype of, you know, this perpetual foreigner, this idea that you're always, you know, going to be foreign, that you're always, you know, going to be othered and be put in this, you know, position where, you know, people will perceive everything that you do as, you know, something that's dirty, disgusting, and you know, oftentimes it's actually, you know, the system, but other people within the system labeling, you know, East Asian people as such, and it extends to other groups as well. So I think this particular, you know, idea and theme of like what is good, what is bad, and having other people's perception determine that, it's so relevant to this context now, right? And so yeah, and I feel like both you and I have, you mentioned as well for you, like it would be so hard to hear like you're a bad Korean, or having these labels put on you. And like that's, those are my experiences as well, this idea of like I've actually been told that like
that you're a bad Chinese. Oh no.
Right? Like and
by who?
Oh I don't think we can get it.
That's okay.
But it's like it's people having these expectations of how you should be.
Yeah.
And if you don't meet those expectations, all of a sudden you're this bad foreign thing that you need to be othered, and it affects people like very, very deeply, and this idea of like having to chase, validation from oppressors is absolutely like not okay. And
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And this idea of like, yeah, it's not okay. And also like we still navigate that. And oftentimes even for myself, like, yeah, you as much as you try to resist that, it always like we're in this society. So it's like, how do you not want that, validation, from not from other people, but it's almost like a safety piece because you don't want to be labeled, as this foreigner, because, that's going to stick with you for the rest of your life. Right. So.
And I was going to say, like, what does it mean to be good and what does it mean to be bad? And when I really think about it, I think, like when our oppressors say we are good, I feel like it means we're not making them uncomfortable. We're making them feel either real good or just comfy, and we're not making them uncomfy. And that's how I would describe like good and bad. And then like it's not a label that we chose. It's more like a label that we are given. And even when we, talk about like, proximity to whiteness, or even when we look at this family, like Sunja's family, in the end, they end up being rich. They end up having financial privilege. But did that deter them from being discriminated against? Absolutely not. So what I'm trying to say is like all those people out there thinking all these East Asian doctors and lawyers are not being discriminated against because they have money, they are still being discriminated against.
Absolutely. Like, and that's part of like this idea of like, model minority myth. Like it is absolutely a stereotype because it actually allows people to say, like, oh, because you became a doctor or a lawyer or whatever type of profession, you are this model citizen all of a sudden, and you
made it.
You made it in this, in this world, in this society, and that actually prevents people from actually taking this idea of, how they experience oppression in a real context because of, a label that was given that they are some sort of like model citizen, right? And it's so it's so frustrating, but it also is like so detrimental to people's just entire well-being and the whole, move towards, trying to dismantle oppressions. Because then if you are labeling people in these categories, people are not actually going to, understand and recognize and acknowledge the actual oppression that is happening, because you're saying, okay, you are this good citizen now we don't have to worry about anything, right? But it's almost like it's interesting because it's like it almost can oscillate, right? Like between this idea of like you are given a certain label of, okay, you became a doctor, so yeah, you don't experience racism. And then all of a sudden during, instances like, COVID-19, where everyone was, looking at East Asian people as, you know, disease carriers and having all these tropes, and all of a sudden, like, everybody who is East Asian, you know, they're in a risky position and they're labeled as foreigners. And so it's exactly what you're saying. It's the idea of, you know, you're given labels and you can't escape it. No matter how hard you try, like, these are going to be given to you. And how do you navigate that, right? Like,
the perpetual foreigner. And then who told us, who came up with this idea? I mean, we kind of know who came up with it.
But we know who came up with the idea. And at the same time, it's like, why? Like, we have to question why this keeps happening, right? Like, that's, I think, for me, like, the big thing is, yes, we can understand, you know, the pathways of it happening. And it's like, no one wants to be labeled in a certain way. And it goes beyond, like, this is why, like, I think when we're talking about, you know, just have courage, or, you know, just, you know, be secure in yourself or be confident, like, okay, people can have all those things and at the same time, you know, be given labels by, you know, the system of oppression. And so I think that's why it's so hard for me even, like, to rely on this notion of, like, just, you know, just be resilient or have this courage and do all these things. And it doesn't acknowledge, like, it's often we can't escape these situations. So it's, And
it's interesting because even if, let's say, I am considered good by some, some might also say I am bad, right? And then do I live my life chasing after that validation of being good, defined by others, especially oppressors, or do I live my life defining what good means for me? So I guess that would be how I navigate it. Is it easy? Easier said than done, obviously. But I guess, like, for me, for example, I do acknowledge that I have a lot of privilege. Like, I speak English. I had, you know, post-secondary education. I have financial stability and so forth. So sometimes I feel like people really think that I am protected from discrimination. And I have to say, I have had terrible experiences of discrimination. And I think because of model minority myth, I think it maybe there's some almost like lack of empathy towards me, or if, like, discriminating acts were to happen, I think sometimes people are like, are you sure that happened? Like, really? like people like you get discriminated against? Or oftentimes it's also, you know, that saying where people are like, it's better now, things should be different. And I'm like, I feel like somebody said that in the book too. I feel like, or there was that sentiment of it. I'm like, but it did not get better. Right?
Yep, exactly.
Like, it was like 2 or 3 generations, and, like, they still ended up in Pachinko. They were still discriminated against. I think maybe the language just evolved, or, like, people got more discreet in terms of how they discriminate people, or things like that. But I would say, like, I don't feel protected.
Me neither. And that's such a sad reality, right? Like, it's hard to navigate like that. And it's like what you were saying, like, it's like being gaslit on our experiences because people will question, and then you're in a state of, well, do I even say anything then, because I know I'll be gaslit? And then it's like navigating that whole piece. And of course, like, for, you know, I won't speak for you, but, like, I feel like we're pretty much on the same page of, you know, we will say things, we will advocate for ourselves, we will do these, you know, in the face of something that is, you know, incorrect, unjust, like, of course we will say something. And at the same time, it is such, you know, draining, emotionally taxing, battle to continuously go through when people, and society in general just, doesn't even acknowledge our, true experiences that happen. And so, I just, yes, really resonate with what you're saying of, you can, have certain things and achieve certain things, but, being discriminated against, it's on so many different levels. Like, these are real experiences for both you and for both myself, like, and other people as well. Like, but it's such a sad reality,
But I think that's why it's good that you and I are talking about these different themes and then our experiences, because I guess our goal is to kind of like humanize ourselves and then like other women of East Asian ancestry, just expanding our narratives, expanding the context of which people know about us, or think about us, or assume about us.
Our stories and these experiences like in the book, like these are, this is why we come into this podcast, wanting to share, these often untold stories and experiences that happen, and to, reach out to other people, other East Asian women who are also experiencing similar things, and to say, you're not alone. Like, this is happening to me and you and, so many other people. And it's, we don't have to be alone in this journey, right? Because there is a community of people, and sometimes it's hard to find.
And kind of like in the book Pachinko, I feel like a big message that I feel like the author was trying to relay, or maybe I thought that's what she was trying to do, is this notion of that, like, your story or your experience is valid regardless of what other people think or say, right? Because when we look at it from the main characters, like Sunja and her family, and their perspectives of what had happened might be very different from other character, like sub characters, but then doesn't mean it's not valid just because other people don't see it or they don't believe it. So I guess that's kind of how I carry myself, in the sense that even if people don't see what I see, doesn't mean what I know is false.
Or what you experience is false.
That's true, yes.
Right?
Yes.
Like, these experiences are real. Like, and we can't, it's obviously, it's like easier said than done, as a lot of the things that we were saying, but like, we can't let other people, create those, realities and narratives for us.
What else is coming up for you in terms of this book, or maybe like final thoughts, maybe?
Yeah. Identities of women and how that, gets played out in this book, and also how it resonates in,
our experiences.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about that? I feel like this is like an important theme to touch on, right?
Yeah, because when I think about Korean women in my life, or even when I look at Sunja and the sister-in-law Kyung-hee, like, a lot of the stereotypes of Korean women that you hear about in the book, or ones that I've seen growing up, are that women belong in the kitchen. They are responsible for the domestic duties. In the book, they talk a lot about women being expected to be feminine, have a slender figure, and then like have all this nice clothes and makeup and be womanly, essentially. And then I think in the book it was stressed multiple times that Sunja was not that ideal, did not fit that ideal. And also that maybe Sunja was also more outspoken than most, because I think other women in the book were more passive or even submissive, because like Kyung-hee, for example, she listened to her husband. Like, the husband, whatever he said, that was the rule. No questions asked, right? And in my family, I mean, because of patriarchy, like, usually the sons had the most privilege, right? And then I remember growing up like questioning this. So when I was growing up, I would go to my paternal grandparents' house, and then we would all get together during like New Year's, like Lunar New Year, or like Korean Thanksgiving, and then women would be huddled by the kitchen and they would be just cooking all day. And then you see what the men do. They're just having their soju and then just yapping about whatever. And then I remember even as a young girl asking my mom, like, hey, how come like dad's over there? Like, he'll be helping out at home, but I'm like, he seems different, when he's with all the other men in the family. So just, again, binary, but this time with like, what does a woman do? What does a man do? And sometimes I feel like these stereotypes like follow us, not just like Korean women, but like East Asian women in general, that we're passive or submissive, or that we're all skinny and we all have long dark hair.
I know.
Because I'm like, I don't know about all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like these stereotypes follow us. And if you go against the stereotypes, if you are, outspoken, if you do speak up and you don't look the ways that people perceive you to be, then of course there's always going to be a problem. And people will be like, well, you're not meeting the expectation of a submissive, very thin East Asian woman that I want you to be, and it's like, when we think about so much of this is, identities and like development of identities, and like how, when you're given, again, these labels, how do you then like resist that and also find who you are for yourself? Like, that's such a hard process that I've found as well. Like, even in my own upbringing, is like, how do you navigate that when, in your body or soul that like you are not that stereotype, and how do you push against that? It's very interesting, especially when I like think of my own life. Like, growing up, I always wanted to be, I always did like want that label of like, okay, I'm gonna like spend so much time on my hair and my makeup, and try to be thin and wear, like have my like skin all nice and all these different components, and that totally is the stereotype. And then as I got older, I'm like, nope, that's definitely not me, right? Like it's and it comes out for people in different ways, but it's it's hard to almost come against that when you're growing up and be given these labels, and also navigating different workplaces when these are the labels of what East Asian women should be from other people's perspective.
And
right?
I think it's kind of layered too, because when we think about these stereotypes from within our culture, like I feel like I don't meet those standards. But then in terms of like Western perspectives, maybe we do fit the stereotypes that people see us in, and maybe these stereotypes are more positive, quote unquote positive, compared to like other stereotypes from other cultures. But then I think this is another thing where people might be like, oh yeah, but like, let's say like a white man thinks I'm submissive or, cute and petite, and people think that's a good thing. But then what does it come with? Yellow fever.
Yes.
And then what is that?
Yes.
Form of racism and discrimination.
Yes.
So it's interesting how one might think that it's a good thing. But me personally, someone who've experienced racism and discrimination, I'm like, no thanks. I did not sign up for this, and here we are.
Yeah, exactly. And the specific, experiences when, you're experiencing like misogyny and racism at the same time, and how that's so complex, especially like you were saying, like that's such a good point, like within cultures and beyond cultures, because I would say that's totally the experiences that I've had as well, like especially with, you know, Asian men, specifically Chinese men, and how that's how I'm perceived. And it's almost like I don't meet that, you know, quote unquote criteria.
Right.
So then it's like, oh, I will be threatened by me, or like what you stand for. You're too outspoken, you're too like aggressive, and all these different components, and you're not petite enough, and you know, the perception of you know, from white men. And then it's like all of a sudden what you were saying, it's like, okay, well, it's all these like good stereotypes, but it's like, oh, I don't want any of it. Like
No.
I don't want
Still
to
feels
experience-
creepy. If I have to be brutally honest. So
Yes.
I'm getting the ick, so too ick.
Two icks.
Yep. It's interesting you were talking about like Chinese men, because my parents, like I've been married for a while now, but before I was married and even before I was like seriously dating, I remember my mom specifically telling me that, oh, you probably shouldn't date or like marry a Korean guy, because she literally said it'll end in a divorce. Because I clearly did not fit this perfect Korean wife image, whatever that is. I mean, I ended up not marrying a Korean man, but yeah, that's so interesting, right? That my mom clocked it.
Yeah.
Not to say all Korean men are, you know, thinking that you need to fit this like perfect Korean wife ideal. But I think she was thinking, especially with her experience, I'm sure it was more pronounced during like when she was growing up and when she was looking for, you know, person to date or to marry, that like there were expectations, there were like rules to follow. And then me, I'm like, she's like, what happened to you?
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, like, all of this is not to, like, put a stereotype on, like, different groups of people, like, and I think that's important to remind people that, yes, like, these are our experiences, and, you know, there can be, you know, people that, that are accepting, and, you know, don't force people to, specifically us, to like live in these standards that, you know, don't resonate with us, you know. So I think that's important to highlight and to mention. But yeah, that's so interesting about like your mom mentioning to you about like to not date or marry a Korean man because of that. So I think that's
she was like, you're not gonna make it. I don't know if she meant for me or for the guy. Either way, it was gonna end in a divorce. So
yeah, but I mean, yeah, moms, maybe they, you know, have important things to share and say. And
I was gonna say, I think that has more to do with her experiences. And then I think when we read when we talk about our next book, The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, we can really get into our mom's experiences, and then talk about how that might have affected them and how that might have affected how they communicate to us about their expectations or who they think we should be. You know?
Oh, we could go on for days on that, because I think it's not just like family expectations in, you know, East Asian cultures. It's also like external pressures, right? Of like how you should be in certain, you know, spaces, and also careers, and you know, just there's so much to go along with that, and how to actually stay, you know, rooted in what you want to do and also your values, and like where is that, you know, happy medium and those boundaries of like doing things, for yourself and what you're interested in and what you're passionate about, and also that pressure to like do things for a collective, right? And it's such a, I think an interesting dynamic. And when we think about, the book, it's like, it's almost like in this specific context that it was written, right? The people, the characters were like mentioning or kind of like, going about in action that yes, you do things, for the family and you show up in a certain way. And I think like when we take those lessons and kind of like reflect on it in our context, like it's almost like it's so much more like, not so much more, but it is just complex in that manner, right? Like, so I think it's, but we'll definitely explore that more down the road.
Which means y'all need to catch our next episode.
Yes. Catch the next episode. Episode 3. We'll be exploring a new book, and we have some interesting reflections and themes to come out of it. And
we're gonna be talking about mommy issues.
Uh-oh.
Cheers.